February 20th, 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and shortly thereafter annexed the territory. On February 24th, 2022, Russian troops crossed over into Ukrainian territory and began their invasion once again. The question I want to answer today, however, is why a country that has such a pronounced history of wanting to accrue strategic and resource-rich territories would sell Alaska, an extremely large territory, with an abundance of resources to the United States. Russians started to settle Alaska in 1784, setting up trading posts mostly along the coast. They settled the Alaskan territory mostly for its abundance of fur-bearing mammals. This was especially of interest to the Russian Empire as their stocks of furry creatures in Siberia had been greatly depleted due to overhunting. They didn't find much else there of use, however, and considered most of the inland territory as useless land, only settling further east to accrue more land as a sign of power for the Russian Empire. Yet, by the middle of the 19th century, profits from their colonies in Alaska were in steep decline. Competition with the British Hudson's Bay Company over in Canada, still being run as British colonies, had brought the sea otter to near extinction, while the population of bears, wolves, and foxes on land was also nearing total depletion. In fact, there were never more than 400 Russian settlers in Alaska at any given time throughout the entirety of its colonization. Though the Aleut people that were already present had been largely peaceful to the Russians, the Tlingit tribes nearby were far more resistive, leading to sporadic episodes of violence, especially as the natural hunting grounds became less and less fruitful. This meant more money needed to be diverted to keep the Alaskan colonies in line, colonies that were already hurting for money. The Russians quickly saw less and less of a reason to keep sending costly ships all the way around Siberia to support the few people they had there with the rations and weapons they so desperately needed. The Russians may have wanted to retain the land, if for nothing else than for pride's sake, had they not run into a conflict in Europe. In October of 1853, the Crimean War broke out, fighting mainly on the Crimean Peninsula. The war dragged on for nearly 3 years, and saw Russia taking on the Ottoman Turkish, French, and most importantly, British armies. It was a costly war both in human bloodshed and disease. While there were over 100,000 Russian battle casualties, this paled in comparison to their nearly 300,000 men that died from disease, malnourishment, and exposure, including the Tsar himself. When the war finally came to a close in February of 1856, Russia was hurting for money, and historians have found that Russia was worried after the Crimean War ended that Alaska's neighboring colonies, run by the British, were likely to invade the territory. This was in part because of the British success in the Crimean War, at least compared to Russia. They had lost less than 5,000 men on the battlefield, and approximately 16,000 to illness. Many lives lost to be sure, but it still left them in a much better position to keep the party going than the Russians. So the Russians thought, if we're going to lose the territory anyway, why not at least get some money to help pay off our mounting war debts? Russian expansionism turned to Asia instead of the Americas, and the American philosophy of manifest destiny made for the perfect customer to stick it to the British while also getting them a payday. The first Russian offer to sell Alaska to the United States was in 1859. The Tsar's brother had publicly declared Alaska a luxury that Russia was ill-prepared to afford. Russia came to the table after having their own internal debate about what the land was truly worth. However, when they asked for the United States to negotiate with them, everything had to be put on pause immediately, as the U.S. decided they needed to figure out who should actually own the land before they put any money on the table to buy it. Which brings us to 1861, the beginning of the American Civil War. Now I'm mostly going to skip over what happens in the American Civil War here, as its context within this historical event was mainly to delay the talks on the purchase of Alaska. The Russian situation by the end of the Civil War in early 1865 was no better than when it had started, and internally they had decided that the absolute lowest amount that they could part with the land for was $5 million. After the Civil War had calmed down, the Russians reached back out to the U.S. asking if this was a better time to talk. The man they got in contact with was William Seward, and Americans should be glad they did, because without this particular Secretary of State, America may not have its biggest state. Even as the Civil War had been kicking off, then Senator William H. Seward, who spent his whole life as a die-hard believer in the expansionism and manifest destiny, declared that the towns and forts of Alaska would yet become the outposts of my own country. Seward was the one to bring up the negotiations with Russia after the war, and he was the one to meet up with Eduard de Stokel, the Russian minister to the United States. Stokel had received authorization from the Tsar to sell the territory if they could get it within the agreed-upon price range. Secret negotiations between Seward and Stokel began around March 11, 1867. They still attended their regular jobs during the day, but they worked fervently throughout the night on the treaty that would be signed on March 30th. It stipulated that the United States would purchase Alaska for $7.2 million in gold. Seward immediately took the treaty to the Senate, hoping that they would ratify the treaty on the same day. But the matter was not quite as pressing for them as it was for Seward himself. It remained pending for a week and a half, and during that time it proceeded to become a hot topic among the public. Although most supported the deal on paper, there was a very vocal minority that mercilessly lambasted it, referring to Alaska as Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, while Russia, Russian Fairyland, and eventually by its most well-known name of mockery, Seward's Folly. An editor of the New York Tribune was one of the most vocal in opposition to the acquisition of Alaska, stating that it was a burden not worth taking even as a gift. Some of the senators who would soon be voting on whether or not the treaty could be ratified were equally skeptical, with one joking that he would support taking possession of the land only if Seward himself be forced to live there. Ultimately, it comes down to the idea that Alaska as a whole was seen as a waste of land. It wasn't very fertile for most crops, it was cold and often icy, and it seemed like the Russians had a hard time supplying it. In the week and a half leading up to the ratification, Seward hosted several luxurious dinner parties to try and sway the senators that were on the fence. In the end, there was a failed attempt to delay the proceedings of the treaty, and it ended up being approved on April 9, 1867 by a 37-2 vote. President Andrew Johnson appointed General Lovell H. Rousseau to facilitate the transfer of power. Sailing out of New York on August 31st, Rousseau made his way across Panama and up to San Francisco, where ships laden with troops and supplies were waiting for him. From there, he endured seasickness and chills on the slow voyage north to Sitka, the only sizable Russian town in Alaska, arriving on October 18th. Later that day, the Russian flag was taken down and the U.S. flag was raised in a ceremony attended by Russian and American troops and even a few of the indigenous leaders. All interactions between the Russians and Americans were of the friendliest character, reported Rousseau, who would go on to describe the climate, the people, the fisheries, and even the potatoes. The Russian troops departed, and all Russian civilians that lived there were given the option of returning home to Russia or becoming U.S. citizens. But the saga surrounding Alaska's purchase did not end there. Intent on embarrassing President Andrew Johnson, who was impeached in February 1868 but survived removal from office by one vote, House Republicans refused to appropriate cash for the purchase. Finally, in July of 1868, after Johnson lost the Democratic presidential nomination, the House of Representatives voted 113-43 to hand over the money to Russia. But that's not the end of it either. In a surprising twist, a congressional investigation later determined that Stokel, the Russian minister, bribed lobbyists and journalists during this time period to convince them to help the sale go through. Private notes written by Johnson and another U.S. official suggest that Stokel likewise made tens of thousands of dollars in illicit payments to members of Congress, and this all happened with Seward's knowledge. Supposedly, Russia was so desperate to get rid of the Alaskan territory that they were willing to use tens of thousands in bribes to get America to take it. Scandal notwithstanding, Seward wasted no time in enjoying the fruits of his labor, heading to Alaska within months of retiring from government in 1869. In Sitka, he toured a brewery and sawmill, attended church, met with the city council, viewed a military parade, and just walked the streets. While he was there, he accurately predicted that Alaska would become both a state and a tourist attraction. Today, an Alaskan city, highway, and peninsula are all named for him, as is a state holiday that commemorates his once ridiculed purchase. While $7.2 million for a territory that enlarged the U.S. by 586,000 square miles, nearly twice the size of Texas, sounds like a great deal, it is, but the often referenced 2 cents per acre figure isn't adjusted for inflation. If you were to put the deal in the context of today's value of money, you would find that Alaska was purchased for $133 million, which, yeah, is still a great deal. That comes out to be just 37 cents per acre. But numbers like this are often hard to understand without ample context. The absolute bare minimum you can buy land for today in the United States is $157 per acre. That's in Gerlach, Nevada, in a desert where there is very little vegetation and harsh conditions. The average farm real estate value in the US, counting pretty much all rural land outside of the far more expensive city plots, is $3,160 per acre. And just for fun, in New York City it would run you about $5.2 million per acre. You could rightfully make the argument that a purchase of land between countries is handled differently than between citizens within a country, and that similarly to choosing Sam's Club over Walmart, buying in bulk will ultimately get you a much better deal. Yet, despite this, we can look to today's Alaska to very easily see just how good of a deal this turned out to be for the United States. Alaska's GDP in 2020 was about 50.65 billion US dollars. So far, Alaska has produced about 33 million ounces of gold, holding an estimated 2% of the world's total gold reserves. It also produced 165.85 million barrels of oil in 2020 alone, as well as $4.8 million of Made in America goods. Those figures were from 1 year. From a monetary standpoint, Alaska has paid for itself many times over. Yet it can also be used for its strategic position situated near Russia, able to act as a line of defense from Russian attacks. Although the deal for Russia made total sense at the time, you would be hard-pressed, with the 155th anniversary of the treaty on the horizon, to find anyone that would say it was the right move long-term. Thank you for watching Learn Something New. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more, and feel free to check out some of the other videos on the channel as well. See you next time.